Title: The most feared warrior tribe that wasn't Vikings. Everyone thinks they know the face of fear on a battlefield. They picture iron helms and dragon-proud ships, the roar of the North Sea and the flash of a broadaxe. But fear, the kind that turns cities into whispers and bright frontiers into blank space, wore no horned helmet. It rode on a wind across an ocean of grass, low to the earth, so fast the eye could not tell where the rider ended and the horse began. It came when the moon was fat and silver, just enough light to find a door latch or a sleeping sentry. And for 2 centuries, from the Rockies to the Gulf, people had a single word for that fear: Comanche. Long before maps called it the American West, cartographers shaded the middle of the continent with doubt. Presidios on the Spanish frontier sank into themselves at sunset, shutters drawn, horses penned tight. Mexican villages whispered prayers for sons on the road. Anglo settlers in Texas learned to listen to the far edge of silence. Out in the tall blue stem and spiny yucca, something moved like a mirage and then became thunder. 100 hooves swallowed distance. The first you saw was the glint of a rawhide shield. The first you heard was the crowing scream of a rider. The first you felt was the rush of air as a lance went by where your heart had been a breath earlier. When dusk fell, you counted. If everyone was there, you exhaled. If someone wasn't, you didn't say their name. They were not born to the saddle. That's the part people forget. The people who would call themselves na-na-na-na-na, the people, began north. Mountain people, Shoshonekin. On foot they hunted, gathered, moved with the seasons like every other nation under a continent-wide sky. Then the Spaniards, with their glittering armor and imported saints, let slip something into that world that could not be contained: horses. What the conquistadors corralled and counted, the plains took back, and herds scattered like stars across the prairies. In the late 1600s, a trade became a theft, became a revolution. Somewhere on a wind-bent ridge, a young hunter gripped the back of a runaway Mustang and felt the ground unhook from beneath him. In the second it took to understand that he could move as fast as a storm, a new people were born. They broke from their Shoshone cousins, turned their faces south, and found a land perfectly suited to what they were becoming. Rolling grass, few trees, endless visibility, rivers braiding silver through buffalo country. They learned balance before they learned letters. Children were slung to the backs of ponies with rawhide thongs so they would never fear a fall. Girls and boys alike felt the world at a gallop, learned with their knees and their backs how to move as the horse moved. A grown warrior could swing down behind his horse's neck, using the animal's body like a shield, his torso hidden from musket fire while his bow arm reached under the mane and sent an arrow through a target the size of a coffee cup. He could load and loose 6 shafts before a soldier could ram home a second ball. He didn't carry a longbow fashioned for static war in shadowed forests. His was short, sinew-backed, a thunderbolt that bent like a question mark and answered like a hammer. Up close, the arrows punched rawhide and cloth, and sometimes even the low-grade iron that Spanish frontier budgets could afford. Speed was their doctrine. Mobility was their god. They did not build stone towns or carve their names into pillars because they didn't need to. Their monument was movement. No fortress could hold them because they would not stay where a fortress mattered. They flowed around walls, drifted down trails at night, and fell on a herd or a way station with the precision of hunger. They took what made sense: horses, mules, captives to adopt or ransom, cloth, guns when guns became reliable, and left before the dust settled. Empires wrote reports that tried to pin them down like an officer's finger on a map, but the people were never there when the ink dried. The space they owned was not just land, it was time, the difference between how fast you could ride and how fast they could. The Spanish learned to call parts of the southern plains by a new name: Comancheria, the realm of the Comanche. It wasn't a kingdom with a crown, it was a lived reality enforced daily by hooves and sinew and memory. It stretched from the Pecos to the Cross Timbers, from the Arkansas down towards the Nueces, a place where caravans moved only in force, and where messengers were as valuable as silver. Mexican herders grazed their stock within sight of their villages, and still slept lightly, because a bright full moon in late summer, what later Texans would call a Comanche moon, could turn a quiet valley into a churn of dust and screams. The world, of course, pushed back. Governors on the far side of a desert drew up plans. Presidios stocked more powder, more muskets, more prayers. A Spanish force from New Mexico met a Comanche leader they called Greenhorn, Cuerno Verde, in a running battle in the late 1700s that ended in a death and a trophy. Proof, finally, that the people could be killed. But what the Spanish did next was more telling. Antonio de Anza, the very man who struck that blow, turned to the long game. Treaties, he thought. Trade. If you could not beat speed, you might feed it. In 1786, he brokered peace, and suddenly the frontiers were braided together with fairs and markets. Comanche men rode in to swap buffalo robes and horses for guns and iron and coffee and bright cloth. Comanche women traded skill and craft for kettles and beads and needles that made life easier in camp. A new economy rose, lively and violent and full of risk, and it ran on the fuel of grass and blood. At its core was the buffalo. To live on the southern plains was to live in rhythm with the herds, to hear a lowing as constant as wind. The people took what they needed and scaled up when they could. They tanned robes, processed meat, fat, brains, hide, sinew, until nothing was left but hooves to be boiled and bones to be thinned into needles. The robe trade boomed. Horses multiplied in numbers the Spanish could not believe. Herds spread like dark lakes under the morning sun. Captives were folded into families, or not, depending on the year, the hunger, the calculation of value. Society flexed around war, but it was not only war. There were jokes and songs, standards of beauty, and codes of insult. There were ceremonies under star fields so large they made you feel small enough to harm no one. And yet, always the edge, because prestige for a young man still came best with a string of enemy horses and a tale told over the winter fire. Raiding was not chaos, it was craft. Scouts moved days ahead, reading wind and spoor like scripture, sniffing the smoke of a distant cook fire and guessing numbers, discipline, fear. The strike came before dawn if possible, when a sleeping horse has to wake before it can bolt. A lariat sang out, a rawhide shield flashed, a woman ran for the brush with a child in her arms, and 3 hands reached for her at once, and depending on whether the odds looked bad or good, she might live to speak of it. If a village defended well, if the men came fast and steady, the raiders vanished like a mirage. If they did not, the raiders turned methodical. It wasn't personal until it was. Outsiders wrote of cruelty as if they had invented kindness. The journals of officers staining paper with righteous ink did not mention Spanish slave raids that had ravaged Pueblo towns, or Mexican militias who retaliated with equal fury, or Anglo rangers who took scalps as bounty and presented them as proof of duty. It was a hard place made harder by hunger, disease, and pride. The Comanche did not invent it, they excelled within it. And because they excelled, they set the tempo. The Comanche barrier, mapmakers would say, and then mark the blank space in the middle of their tidy borders with stippling and caution. The reality on the ground was simpler. If the people wanted you to pass, you could pass. If not, you built your town closer to the fort. As the 19th century crept on, new players arrived with new flags. Anglo settlers came pouring into Texas like a breaking dam, full of restless hope and borrowed time. They built cabins fast and fences faster, and told one another stories about how courage could root itself in soil and bloom into a nation. They learned, sometimes too late, that courage is not the same as speed. When the Comanche came, the difference was visible in the ground itself. A boy's tracks running to a thicket, a cluster of spent cartridges around a doorway, a blood trail that ended at the place where hooves blurred it to dust. Texas, to these newcomers, became a lesson in how to live behind your own gate, and how to look up at night when the moon was too bright. Still, something shifted. Repeating firearms were being born back east. The buffalo trade cut herds down to smaller shadows of their old size. Diseases, slipping through trade like poison in a river, ate at populations in ways no lance ever could. And yet in the late 1830s, even with the tide beginning its slow, relentless turn, the people could still gather force like a storm front. Pride and rage, both old companions, answered a new insult. In San Antonio, in a council house, Texans and Comanche met under a flag of truce. Misunderstanding curdled into treachery. Shots cracked where words should have bridged the distance. Comanche diplomats died on a floor meant for talking. Outside in the plaza, the dust turned red. News travels fastest among the aggrieved. Across the camps and lodges of the Comanche, names were spoken in a single voice. Buffalo Hump, a war leader with eyes like cold rain. Others as fierce alongside him. They would not let the council house go unbalanced in the scales. They chose a target not just for blood, but for meaning. Not a lonely ranch or a single fort, but a ribbon of wealth itself, the very road to the sea. August 1840. On the Texas coast, the port town of Linville wakes to ordinary heat. Warehouses sweat with stored goods, bolts of cloth, barrels of sugar and coffee, stacks of mirrors that catch the white sky and throw it back. Men argue about prices. Women lay out clothes to dry, fine imported fabric catching a rare salt breeze. In the shallows beyond the wharves, small boats rock, their ropes creaking like tired throats. Far inland, a sound begins like a loose shudder in wind. It grows, low and steady, and then it multiplies, as if the earth itself had learned to breathe. By mid-morning, someone on the edge of town looks up because the air feels wrong. The horizon, that blue blade where prairie meets sky, wavers like heat over stone. Tiny dots stitch themselves along its length, and then they gather, and then they become a line. Someone shades his eyes. It could be cattle. It could be a storm. It could be the thing everyone talks about and nobody believes will happen today. He hears it then, even over the gulls and the slap of bay water against pilings, the rhythm of hooves on hardpan, a sound that seems to arrive both from far away and from just behind him, like a name spoken in a dream. The first rider breaks clear of the shimmer, painted, plated, hair and reins flying, horse low and fast, 3 more at his shoulder. Behind them, 1,000 pults of movement catch the sun and start to sparkle. In town, a woman freezes, her hands full of linen. A boy reaches for the bell rope. A clerk, half listening to the nagging voice in his ear about invoices and ship's manifests, finally looks past the ink and sees the future arriving in dust. On the water, a fisherman drops his net and stands, both palms slick with fish scales, staring. The line of riders spills wide, wider than a street, wider than a thought, and laughs cut the wind like knives. The scent that hits first is leather and sweat and the dry, living tang of grass. A warrior leans out from his galloping horse, the world tipping at a dangerous angle, and his bowstring hums. Somewhere, far back on the prairie where the road kinks around a stand of live oaks, more riders are still pouring in, their voices braiding into one long rising sound, the promise of a raid whose legend would outlast everyone now breathing. What happened on that coast will be measured later in piles of goods scattered across the grass, in smoke rising off a port made suddenly small. In the way Texans scramble to answer a force too fast to catch. But in this moment, right here, the rush is just beginning. And every step that brought the people to this point, every horse caught, every treaty signed and broken, every night ride under a silver coin of a moon, presses forward into a single day when even the sea seems to hold its breath.